In this video you'll see the creation of the German field kitchen from a pile of plastic, complete creation of the basis for the diorama, and of course the painting and detailing of this base. Let's begin. Hello viewers! I'm starting this video by demonstrating a part of the German field kitchen model. I made the previous part on my burnt out camera, so I can't show it to you. But let's continue making the rest of this model. My next step will be working on the wheels for this field kitchen. Actually, it's a keychain in the shape of a steering wheel that I bought online. Now I need to turn this keychain into this detail. For this I'm using sandpaper and my new tool. This tool proved to be very useful, and with its help I managed to make good details that won't spoil the impression of the final diorama. Great! Now I'm taking a pile of plastic parts and using them to add more detail to my model. First I cut out a plate from a plastic sheet, which will become one of the main parts for the field kitchen body. Then I use thick paper to hide any excess pieces of plastic that spoiled the overall look of the model. After sanding in a plain lanes, the result looks like this. I think the model already looks pretty good, and now I can make the holes that are represented on a real field kitchen. The first row of holes didn't turn out perfectly even, but actually I wasn't really trying to make it perfect. The second row brought even more problems. I a little bit break my hand drill while working on it, but I don't care about it too much. The result of this work turned out satisfactory. Now I need to move on and use the electric tool again to remove the excess and then glue a piece of thick paper in this place. After painting, the result will be much better than it looks now. And you know what? That's enough of boring you with the explanation of each of my steps. After all, there is nothing difficult about gluing a few plastic plates to the model, right? Let's move to more interesting moment. The first task to solve was the frame for the field kitchen. After all, something needs to attach the model itself and its wheels. Once again, my plastic parts come to the rescue. And I want to say again that by buying such parts you really can do a lot. For example, the parts I'm using right now for the frame are perfect for simulating railway tracks in 1/72 scale. And I don't think it's necessary to list all the possible uses of these parts, because you see how I apply them in each of my videos. The main thing in working with this plastic detail is your ingenuity and imagination. As you can see, while I'm talking about plastic parts, I already glued the frame for our model. All that's left is to glue on the small details, like brakes, a tow bar, and the thick piece of paper to simulate the platform on which the cook usually stands while cooking. After gluing everything together, it's got a pretty decent model of a German field kitchen in 1/72 scales. But then I thought it would be nice to show you how I made this detail. Honestly, I don't know its name, but I managed to make it from two plastic tubes and piece of masking tape. Then, adding a small detail from thick paper, I moved on to the final step. On every field kitchen you can see this pipe, which should divert all the smoke to the side, not bothering the cook while preparing food. This detail was installed using a handheld drill, with which I made a hole for the pipe, and super glue, which was used to attach this pipe. Then, after adding a few small details, I can finally say that this model is ready for painting. Yes, perhaps it doesn't look entirely realistic, and some of this detail may not look good for the scale I need, but I'm sure this model won't spoil the overall impression of the diorama, so we can move on. Off camera, this model was primed. And now it's time to mix the tan and black color from Vallejo to get the grey color, typically used for such field kitchen in the German army. Naturally, after mixing I took an airbrush and started applying the base coat of paint. And I must say, even after the base coat the model looked good, especially considering the fact that it's made from scrap I had laying around in my hobby box. And when the various damages were applied, I ended up with a fantastic model. I was pleased with the work done. And of course I don't forget about my most loved technique. I talk about highlighting all edges of this model.
Stop it. Get some help.
But now we set the model aside and move on to the diorama itself. Of course, the first thing to do is to use foam, which actually is the best material for creating a base for your diorama. I glued together two pieces of this foam to get the height I need. Now it's time to trim off the excess foam and add a little bit extra to show the relief of the terrain. As I mentioned in my YouTube community post, I like it an interesting shoot from the World War II newsreels, and I decided to recreate it, replacing the German military motorcycle with the field kitchen model. In the meantime, as you may have noticed, I glued this balsa wood sheet around the edges of the base to make them visually pleasing. And, of course, neat edges of the diorama will add 100 points of professionalism to it. Don't forget about that. Enough with the jokes and humor. It's time to make a mixture of PVA glue, plaster and dry pigment. Let's mix it. And now the paste to protect the styrofoam from the negative effect of glue and acrylic paint is ready. I need this texture paste because sometimes acrylic acts on styrofoam as a solvent and simply melts it. Of course, I don't want this, so the entire diorama needs to be covered with this substance. While the diorama is not dry yet, I can add various stones that I purchased at the store for aquarium fish. Sometimes I think people from another hobby hates modelers. But okay, this once again confirms the fact that in modeling you can use anything. And since my diorama will simulate mountainous terrain, these small stones are just perfect for it. It's also important to add stones to the diorama immediately, as my paste contains glue, and after drying the stone will adhere very tightly to the styrofoam base. After drying, it turns out to be pretty good imitation of a mountain road with a lot of small stones. But it seemed to me that it looks somewhat strange, so it was decided to add another layer of textured paste, using the real soil. Then, with the help of a brush, this texture paste was smoothed as much as possible to make it look more natural. And when the whole diorama dried, work began on the broken dirt road. For this, another paste was made, thicker than previous one. This will make the traces of transport more interesting and realistic. To apply the traces, I use a simple bamboo stick, which I have mentioned 100 times in my videos. This versatile tool helps to make traces of transport just as I imagined them. The next tool was the tank model that I made in the previous video. To make the model look natural on the diorama and not hang in the air, you need to use it to make the place where it will be glued later. Well, it looked cool. After drying, the traces turned out to be very decent. Before starting the painting, we have to wait for the diorama to dry completely. And to not waste the remaining texture paste, I decided to add a small detail on the top of the diorama. After that, I thought that even in mountainous terrain there might be some bushes and other weeds. So, using material to simulate vegetation, I managed to create small shrubbery on the top of the diorama and at the bottom. Almost everything is ready, now I need to think about how best to add grass to the diorama. And since it's a winter scene, it's best not to add too much. This step was the last for detailing the diorama, and now it's ready for painting. Of course, first of all I apply a black primer layer. Then, making a mix of this paint, I started painting the grass on the diorama. Sorry for such terrible focus, unfortunately I learn very slowly. And while I quickly learn something new and interesting in editing, I constantly encounter problems when working with the camera. But I hope that with the arrival of new camera, everything will change for the better. After painting the grass, it was time to paint the soil. At first glance, it may seem that they are painting in one color. But this is only a weak representation of color on my smartphone. The grass is painted in a more yellowish tone, and the soil in a more brownish tone. The rest of vegetation on the diorama remained black. This choice was made because the diorama will be winter themed, or more precisely sometimes like a transition from winter to spring. Therefore, the black bushes will complement the overall picture of the diorama perfectly. To make the road look more natural, at the end of the painting works, it was painted in a dark color. After this step, I decided to completely repaint the grass. It seems that the whole diorama would be monotonous with patches of white snow, and this is not at all what I want from this diorama. Therefore, the grass acquired a dark green color. I don't know if grass can look like that in early months, but it seemed to me that I simply had no other option. Now I needed to switch tools to a brush to detail the road and applying a light color. I talked more about this painting method in detail in the video about the edge of the forest and warehouse dioramas. When the first light tones were applied to the road, additional work with the grass began. I wanted to create the effect of yellow tips on the grass, and I think I managed to convey it. And then it occurred to me that by making the color used for the tip of the grass less saturated, I could create an interesting effect on the diorama using the dry brushing technique. And you know what? I was right. The dry brushing technique did its job wonderfully. Now all that was left was to give the fallen log a more brownish appearance and apply a glossy acrylic varnish to the rod. This step will show that the rod is wet, which is why it looks broken and has deep traces created by another vehicle. This is also why the field kitchen was left here. Most likely horses or another transport that was carrying this kitchen could have been beyond the edges of the diorama, but apparently something went wrong, and the broken dirt road hindered the movement of the army kitchen. Of course, they turned it out as good as they could without using epoxy resin. Unfortunately, at the time of recording video, I didn't have epoxy resin yet. So we'll leave the puddles and another beautiful water effect for our future diorama. Now let's move on to the final steps. The first one is applying a dark wash based on oil paints. This time I choose not to use my favorite color, Van Dyke Brown. I felt that this color might make the tones of the diorama too warm, which isn't what I am aiming for with this diorama. And it seems to me it was the right choice. The wash blends in nicely with the overall color scheme of the diorama. And now, ladies and gentlemen, we move on to creating the snowy effect. For this we need baking soda, PVA glue, a little white acrylic paint and some water. Mixing all these ingredients to a creamy consistency, we can start applying the snow to the diorama. If you've done everything correctly, this homemade effect won't ruin your diorama. Such snow will lay beautifully on the diorama and look natural. But before applying it, I recommended tasting this mixture on the small piece of styrofoam. A few more tips regarding this mixture. If it's too thick, add more water and keep stirring constantly. This is crucial because all the heavy ingredients of this mixture tend to settle at the bottom of the container. And if you don't constantly stir this mixture, your diorama will end up painted with just water, with added white acrylic. It's not good, right? If your mixture starts to resemble slime, you are probably add too much glue. In that case, either add more glue and water until the mixture look like the one in my video, or mix a new bath. But before adding glue, mix baking soda, acrylic and water, and only after that add PVA glue. Of course, feel free to experiment, and then you'll definitely get the desired result, and maybe even discover some new cool method. I'll now add all the elements of the diorama to their places and demonstrate the final result. As always, I hope you didn't waste your time watching this video and learned something new, or simply enjoyed the viewing. If so, please give this video a thumb up, write what you like and didn't like about this work. Subscribe or not subscribe, it's your decision. And for those who want to support the development of this channel and help me with purchasing figures and another models, and want to have some 3D model created by me, which you can use on your 3D printer, there is a link to my Patreon in the description of this video. With that I bid you farewell, until we meet again.